want to address is the sources of genetic variation, because genetic variation is going to lay down the foundation for natural selection to occur, and then natural selection is going to drive the evolution. It's one of the forces that actually drives the evolution. So now remember that genetic variation has to be, those traits of variation has to be heritable, because you need to be able to pass it on to the next generation. So now the ultimate source of genetic variation are going to be mutations. Mutations can give rise to traits that we've never seen before. That's why we call it an ultimate source of genetic variation. And mutations must happen in the gametes, when the gametes are forming and when you have DNA that's being replicated. So that means the errors occur then. And so that way you can pass on those mutations to the next generation. And this goes back to the heritability. So now if you look at another source of genetic variation, we describe gene shuffling. Well, this is what we saw in meiosis before. Remember, crossing over that's happening between homologous chromosomes in meiosis. And then another layer that gives rise to genetic variation in gametes would be independent assortment. And then once the gametes are formed, there will be random fertilization, because you're going to have millions of sperm cells that are trying to fertilize one egg. So which one is going to get there? Do you see? So that gives you this randomness also. So gene shuffling, I like to compare gene shuffling to think of a deck of cards. You know, you have a certain number of cards in a deck. And the question is, which card are you going to pull out? You know, as far as when you're making gametes, for example, which card? So you can just pull out this one, or you pull out this one, but everything you have, it's already within you. So you're just kind of shuffling those genes. But if you compare gene shuffling to the mutations, this is a true source, because like I said, this can give rise to traits that you've never seen before. These are novel. These could be novel traits, things that were not there before. So another source of genetic variation in population could be gene flow. This is basically migration. If you guys look at these two populations, so I have a simple population of small little population of green bugs, and then I have brown bugs here. You see, and then you see how this one is moving to the other population. So what's going to happen to this population now? It increases the genetic variation, because now the brown bugs are going to reproduce with green, and you'll get some other variation because those genes are going to be shuffled. Maybe they're going to be green and brown, or maybe something in between. So we don't know the patterns, but we'll have some sort of variation happening there. Do you see? So gene flow, migration is going to give rise to genetic variation in the population as well. And then another one, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about it in bacteria, for example, they can transfer the genes via the process of conjugation. Do you remember how they form a little tube, and then they can transfer the plasmid to the next bacterium, and then the next thing you know, the entire colony has that gene. So this is called lateral gene transfer or horizontal transfer, because bacteria don't reproduce sexually. That's why it's transferred in a different way. So now, what effect would natural selection have on the phenotype, and how would that affect the actual population? Let me just make this a little smaller here. So we're going to begin with this original population. I have a population of mice, and you can see the phenotypes in fur color. These are going to vary. So we have some that are very light and some that are very dark. And then majority of the population appears to be somewhere in between, which would be this medium color. So this bell-shaped curve represents my original population. And you can see that, you know, the number of individuals right here on this end, these would be the extremes because these are very low numbers as far as the individuals in the population, but most of it is right here. So now we want to see how would natural selection affect this population. So there are actually three things that can happen. So we're going to use these terms, selective pressure against or selective advantage, when we describe the effect of natural selection on the phenotypes. So for example, if you see that there is selective pressure against the extremes, meaning, see how the arrow is pointing down? So against the extremes, so in this case, against the light colored mice, and then very dark colored mice. And then you can see that the medium color population is increasing. We sort of narrow this curve. So the curve becomes tall and skinny. So the variation is reduced, and it appears that only mice that have medium color fur have the selective advantage in this particular environment. So that's why their population numbers go up. So when you see that happen, when the curve gets skinnier and you can see the range becomes narrow, we call that stabilizing selection. So that means the medium or the average has the selective advantage. It's favored. So now another one, another pattern that you can actually notice or see is directional selection. So if we start with the original population, you can see now it looks like our curve is shifting. So now we had, this was the original population, and it's moving this way. So you can see it looks like all the mice are just getting darker. None of them are actually changing colors because they can't. You know, you have what you have. Because remember we said individuals do not evolve, only populations do. So it means population itself is changing because there are selective pressure against the light ones. So they're not doing well in that environment. But who is doing well? The darker ones. And that's why the darker ones get to survive and reproduce, so their numbers rise. And it looks like the entire population is shifting from what we had before to more dark. Okay, so this change can actually happen in the opposite direction too. So we can shift the curve this way as well and say the light ones have selective advantage. So you can go both ways, but this type of result is what we call directional selection. Now, another one that you're going to see, another pattern that you're going to see is called disruptive or diversifying selection. So what this means, there's a selective pressure against the medium. Do you see how the medium numbers are going down? Who is doing better? The extremes in this case. So the light ones are growing in numbers, you can see, and the population of dark ones is growing as well. So it looks like we are diversifying this, you know, really sort of splitting this population into two, very light or very dark. And as a matter of fact, this is sometimes how you get speciation. These species can diverge so much that they become separate species to the point where they no longer interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. So we say, oh, we have speciation that happened. Now, disruptive or diversifying selection does not always lead to speciation. It's just a possibility. So, all right, so this is what you're going to take away from the slides. Natural selection is going to act on the phenotype. And you can see now how population changes. None of these individual mice can actually change the color to be able to survive in the environment. It's either they have it or they don't. This is why we said the smallest biological unit that can evolve is always a population. Are you with me so far? Yeah? Okay. Now I told you that there are two major mechanisms that make evolution happen. So one of them is natural selection, and now you saw how those populations change And what you get: stabilizing, diversifying, directional selection, all the good stuff. And then you also know about artificial selection. Guess what? There are more. We have other mechanisms that can actually make evolution happen, that drive the evolution. So one of them is going to be gene flow. I already mentioned that one. So this is basically migration. So, and then if there's high migration, the neighboring populations will become sort of similar, you know, because they're going to blend. You've got that gene shuffling going on. So the next one is what we call genetic drift. So that's another factor, another force that can make evolution happen. Except this one is going to be the most common in small populations, not large, and it generally have a negative effect on the population because it reduces the genetic diversity. And believe it or not, this change happens because of a chance. So it's random. Give you an example of two types of genetic drift. So one of them is bottleneck effect. So for example, you have a small population and then some big natural disaster went through the area. It did not discriminate about, you know, in as far as the phenotype of the organisms of the population, you know, and you can see that there's only few survivors at this point. So this bottle represents all the genes, the gene pool. So now you can see in this bottle we have different color marbles. So we have red and yellow and green. So it's genetic variation. So we say if we wipe out the entire population and realize that there are only few survivors, it was just random who survived, because the nature did not discriminate against the phenotype. Do you see? So it means in this case, it looks like the survivors are green and here comes the yellow. So it means this is the surviving population. So now this population will grow. So you're going to see that bell-shaped curve and you're going to see that it's mostly green and yellow. So what happened to our genetic diversity? It went down, because what did we lose? We lost some genes. You see, in this case, we lost the red marbles. So it means these genes are gone. So you can see the loss of genetic diversity. So that would be the bottleneck effect. And again, this happens because of chance. So now another example would be founder effect. You can see from the picture immediately what's going on here. That bird picked up yellow and blue, just accidentally. Could have picked up orange, but picked up flowers yellow and blue, and then flew over to a different location and the seeds fell, and now we have a new population that is nothing but yellow and blue. So that is the established population. So this new population. And it evolved to be that way because of the founders. So the founder seeds were from yellow and blue. Now, if the bird picked up orange, then you would have a population that's nothing but orange. So it's basically whatever the genotype that is going to establish that population, that's what you end up seeing. So this is the founder effect. Okay, and then we also understand that there are other mechanisms that drive the evolution, and another one is sexual selection, because you know organisms do not mate randomly. There's always a preference. And in the way the organisms select their mates is by sort of evaluating the genes, the genetic makeup. For example, this bird has a long tail, very long tail. Well, it's not exactly advantageous for that bird to have this long tail because the predators can catch this bird much easier. However, when it comes to mating, females are going to prefer this bird because, you know, to them, this bird is going to look like it's got good genes. It looks healthy. And if you think that this organism has good genes and looks healthy, so it means that increases your chances when you have an offspring, so the offspring can survive better, increases the chances of survival. So this is why we make that preference. So now if that bird did not have a nice beautiful tail, the females probably would think, what's wrong with that bird? Is he sick? I probably don't want to mate with that bird, right? Because like I said, it's all about the survival and ensuring that your offspring has better chances of survival. So that's why we have sexual selection as a factor as well. So now the question is this: is there a time when evolution is not happening?